Currently, there are a number of different ways people can take out savings, investments, even pensions, and they could be using a myriad of products which they can use to pay for care. Equity release and long-term care annuities, as we say, are just two examples of what they can do.
Today's episode is sponsored by Network Live-In Care. Live-In Care is an alternative option to moving into a residential care home. And at Network Live-In Care, they provide fully trained carers with a minimum of 2 years' experience to live alongside you in the comfort of your own home. A live-in carer will support you with your specific needs and are regulated by the Care Quality Commission. To find out more, go to networklivincare.co.uk. Now let's get to the episode.
Hi and welcome to the Chasing Care podcast. On today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome back Nancy Walters, Chief Operating Officer at Mumby's Live-In Care, and a special guest, Harj Gill, who's a Chartered Advising Partner at Sandringham Financial Partners. He's also a Society of Later Life Advisors, SOLA. I'm sure we'll find out a little bit more about that. And today, what we're going to talk about, it's a huge subject, but what we will try and unravel, and that's why Harj is here, the expert, is to look at where do you begin when looking at funding care? What does it look like? When can you? How should you? Oh, there's so many questions. So, welcome both. And before we start, ladies first, Nancy, just give us a quick introduction as to who you are.
Morning, Gavin. Thank you for having me back. Yeah, I'm Nancy Walters. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Mumby's Live-In Care. Been here now 4 years, and this is a really interesting subject that approaches me weekly with clients and new inquiries. So great to be having these conversations.
Harj, welcome.
Hello, Gavin. Thank you for having me on today, and thank you, Nancy, for inviting me along too. I've been in financial services since '96. My first encounter with giving advice to members of the public on later life care, which is what we call it now, but then it was known as long-term care, was back in 1999 when I was working up north, and I merged with a solicitor and a care home organisation up north, and we started to do some seminars and some publications. But things have evolved a lot in financial services, as they do. However, the public's involvement in how they go about understanding what they do, what their rights are, what they can do with their money, etc., on how they pay for care hasn't unfortunately developed that much. So I have a lot of passion in this subject. I'm an independent financial advisor. I work under Sandringham Financial Partners. I'm also a chartered advisor and I'm a member of SOLA, the Society of Later Life Advisors, have an accreditation with them. And that really, as a package, allows me to focus on areas which I really have a passion for and can specialise on. And later life planning is one of those.
Okay, thanks for that. And let's kick it off with you then, Harj. You're the expert here today. Where do we start with that subject? What do people not know about funding care later in life? Do they know anything?
I think people know a little bit, and I'm sorry to sound in that way, but people don't know too much in this area. They know that they can get some help from the local authority. They may have read that somewhere. They may have heard it somewhere. They may have read somewhere that they can try and protect their assets from the local authority getting hold of them. Some people talk about trusts, but that's as far as it gets to. They don't really know beyond that. So I would say in answer to your question, people generally don't know much.
And whose fault is that?
We could blame the finger on the government. We could blame a finger on so many areas and so many departments. But it's very sad, ultimately, is that people don't know, and they're often coming for advice when it's unfortunately at the point where they desperately need help. So more often than not, people are using their finances and they're realizing how quickly the funds in the bank are going down, whether it's a husband helping his wife, a wife helping their husband, or whether more often than not, it's children acting as attorneys, helping their parents. And they can see the funds are just dropping and dropping and dropping, and they're just beginning to panic. And so, yeah, I wish there could be more signposting. I wish there could be more information. What you're doing here with this podcast is great. ultimately people need to have the knowledge, they need to have more resources on where they can go to get help, really.
Nancy, you're an operator. You actually run a live-in care service. So that's a care provision service. Does that mirror what you find day to day, that people come to you and they really don't know what they should be doing in terms of finding the cash?
Yeah, it's living care always seems to be that urgent purchase, that crisis purchase. And mum and dad only have a limited amount of money in the bank. You know, we can only provide care to stay at home for an X amount of months, maybe a year. It's always a question we get, and most of our clients are private. So it is always a question we have to ask, do you have funds to pay for the care, or who's paying for the care? Sometimes family pays for the care, and then you ask, have you looked at other resources of finding the cash to pay for it? And they're like, well, and the only thing they know about is, I know we can take money out of the house. And you're like, yeah, there is that option, but there may be other options without us knowing, personal in-depth details of what their financial status is. So, yeah, that's when we come to referring people on, signposting on to the likes of Harj, who can give some advice, ask some immediate questions about what have you got, and then he can say, well, this is what I can do for you. So it's always good to be able to, for us to be able to signpost somebody or a client on if they're finding we only have a limited amount of cash or assets to pay for care.
Before I come back to Harj with another sort of question following on from that, can I just clarify first off, because I hear that most people don't want to leave their own home. That's what I hear on the street. But is that reality? Because again, back in the day, I suppose back in my mum and dad's day, you didn't stay at home, you went into a care home. That was the default.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I've been doing a lot lately at the community, is speaking to older people who have capacity, who have, they are there as independent individuals. And you talk to them about, do you receive any care? Yes, I do. What do you have? I have a bit of this. And I said to them, what would you do if, care increased and you actually can't stay at home anymore, but that's what you want? They said, well, then I'll have to go to a care home. And I'm like, well, do you know about living care? This is what you could do. And they say, but when I give them a price, they say, well, how much on average would it cost? When I give them an average price and they say, oh, that's a lot. And I'm like, but do you know how much it would cost to go into a care home? I said, do you own your own home? Yes. I said, but you are still going to have to pay for this care in a care home. And it could be cheaper to stay at home than it can be to go to some care homes. And it's still, I don't want to use the word educating, because I think that says that everybody, uneducated, but it's about making awareness. There is that bit in the middle of, you don't want to go to a care home. You want to stay in your own home with your pet, with your loved one, with your bone china mugs that you drink your tea out of every morning, that you won't get in a care home. This is what we can do for you. This is another service out there. Because I say to people, you haven't got to choose my company. There's a service. There's lots of other companies out there that can enable you to stay in your home, but have the care you need.
And Harj, is that something you've seen over the years, that there's been a change of attitude of people that thought they had to go into a care home when mum or dad gets older, that's what happens, to now saying to you, I don't want to go into a care home, I'd prefer to stay at home, can you help me?
I think there is a
from the
preference.
audience.
Yes, I think there is a preference for wanting to stay at home. I think the challenge people have is not really fully knowing how they go about facilitating that. For some people, it may well be the individual circumstances whereby they're perhaps not sure how many carers they're going to need in the house, whether it, as Nancy said, some people aren't even fully aware of living care. So they may think, this notion that we're going to have carers coming and going. What time are they going to come? What time are they going to leave? How can they help mum or dad or husband or wife, So I think, yes, there is a preference for people wanting to stay in their home. Where I have noticed people wanting to go into a care home, it tends to be where they feel that they have no other choice. A bit similar to what Nancy was saying there. Or it's where they feel the healthcare or that the individual's care needs are such that they feel that the care needs have got to the point where this person can't be cared for at home anymore. and they feel they have no choice but to go to a care home. But as we've discussed, and over the time I've known Nancy and got to learn more and more about living care as an option, more often than not, people can be cared for home, whether it's using hoists or what have you. So I have had some clients where they've had a very bad experience, unfortunately, with carers coming in the home, and they've had a change of care agency, they've had a change of carers, they've had a change in carers' shift patterns. The individual themselves have then had a change in needs, and it's all gone wrong. And to the point where the children have then just had enough, and they think, that's it, we just got to get dad into a care home. That's it. And so that's the instances where I have come across it. Or, we have had instances where people go into a care home for a bit of rest and it doesn't perhaps work out and they want to go back home, or the spouse wants to bring them back home as quickly as possible so that things can carry on as normal as possible, with carers at home.
And you're absolutely right. From everybody's experience in the care sector, we have to think about the person. We call it person-centric care. And a care home isn't right for everyone, and live-in care isn't right for everybody. And let's be honest about it. But the question, I think, begs itself, doesn't it, is to whether or not people actually understand that there is an option. That's the first one. And historically, from my background, I don't think people understand that there is an option. They think that it's domiciliary care. Somebody comes and visits, but that eventually that isn't enough for their mum or dad. So it's a care home is the next clear step. That's the only option that they can see. And explain to me so I can understand this. How do you, as a financial planner, somebody that's the money man, work with somebody like Nancy, who's the operator, to ensure that the right package, the right service is being delivered?
Well, the first thing to mention there is there's no one right service or right option for everyone. Everyone is different. So there's not like there's a package you can take off the shelf and say to someone, here you go, that's for you. Our job, because it's everything we do is so highly regulated, and long-term care, it's a bit bizarre, but those areas where you feel people need more help, they are more tightly regulated, and rightly so, because not everybody has the qualifications to advise the public on those points. And more often than not, people may actually get led the wrong direction or not be given the right advice. So the approach we have to take is, when Nancy would refer somebody to speak to me, the very first thing I have to do is really try and get as good an understanding as I can of their circumstances. That's the very starting point. I'm often speaking to the spouse, or I'm speaking to a child acting as an attorney, or a spouse acting as an attorney. So once we've got the legal bits out of the way, I really have to start to understand their situation. And by that, there's the factual information, which is, okay, what amount of savings have you got? And then we eventually get to the point of understanding, well, what level of income has the individual got? What are their outgoings? And more often than not, the cost of the care home will invariably end up being the largest outgoing they've got. You go through all of these details, and then I have to discuss with the individual, or rather their attorney. I have to understand what their preference is. And that's where it comes out. They want this individual to stay at home, or whatever the situation is. And yes, they've had a care assessment done. They understand what the care needs are. This is how much they think it will cost. And then eventually we get down to understanding a number of things. We have to understand, have they had a care needs assessment done? Are they in a position where they needed to have a financial assessment done by the local authority? Similar to what Nancy mentioned, most of the people I advise end up being self-funders. So they have savings which are above the upper threshold where the local authority would be willing to give financial assistance. So eventually we start talking about the figures. We start helping the individual's family understand what they could be entitled to. And eventually we have to, as well as discussing preferences for care setting, we end up talking about what their preferences are and what they think they should be doing as an attorney, acting in the best interest for the donor. What do they think they should be doing for this individual with their money? Should they be doing equity release to pay for the care in the home? Should they be using their savings, which are with such and such a company? Should they be looking at a long-term care annuity? And so there are a raft of options available. I have to go through all of the process of understanding with them, not only what their circumstances are, but what are their preferences? And at that point, I have to share with them some information about how some of these options could work. So what are the ramifications of equity release? Can you even do it? What's your savings level? At what point might you go to the local authority for help? And if you do, how does that affect your care setting? And so on. And then I will often talk to somebody like Nancy to understand what the individual's care costs are and how long have they been at that level? At what point are they likely to next be reviewed? So you have to have an understanding of all of that. And then we might get on to talking about, well, what do you want to do with those savings? Do you understand what your options are? Some people think about using the money in the bank and that's a very easy sort of situation for people to get their head around and think, well, the money's there. I've got so many other things to worry about. I'll just pay for the care fees. Add that money in the bank. That's fine. I can see it's going down. I'm worrying, but right now that's okay. Then we might talk about, well, do you understand you can invest the money and what are the options with that? And then, as I say, we can then talk about a care annuity as well. And as you mentioned earlier, equity release is also an option. So I have to go through all the options. Eventually we get to the point of working out with the family what's the preferred option for them. And then I would go about advising them on that. Apologies, there's no one right answer. There's a lot involved and have to go through so much with them, albeit at the same time I have to try and help them understand everything too, you know?
And it's something that I've had to learn over a number of years now, because it is so complicated. But the one thing I'm guessing is that because it's so complicated and nuanced, that not many of your clients or potential clients that you first speak to have planned. This is a crisis purchase. Would that be a fair reflection?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, most people come to us when it's a bit too late. We try and encourage care providers and other people to do talks and educate people. But as Nancy said, in her situation with Mumbies, people are coming to them as what you might describe as a crisis purchase. And similarly with me, they might be coming to me when they realize, oh God, what's happening with the money? We really need to think about something now. So I just wish there was a way of signposting people earlier on. But I was having this conversation with a group of people yesterday. How do you actually suggest to somebody in their 50s, do you know that there might come a point where not only might you have to help your folks, but you might have to think about your own future, your own care needs. You know, you have to have that conversation. I have to have that conversation with clients who are in their 60s, their 70s, their 80s, and some in their 90s, because more often than not, they might be coming to me for advice on their pensions or their investments, but I have to make them aware that, by the way, be mindful of what other needs you might have later down the road. But it's such a sensitive topic. How do you actually say to someone, by the way, this might happen. You need to be mindful of that. You need to somehow prepare for that. It's very difficult to have that conversation.
There's that element of where we were talking off air before you joined, Harj, and we were saying about our families and our children. And even now, we'd say, it's all right, if I don't have any money, that's okay, because the safety net is the council will put you in a care home. You know, I've had friends who have no children, and I say to them, who's going to look after you when you're old? Who's going to support you? What have you got in place? And they're like, well, I'll just go to a care home. So there's always that, people have that perceived safety net of thinking, oh, but I'll just go to a care home. But they don't realise today, in the future, what that might look like for them as an individual.
Just like to take a short break from the show. My name's Gavin Chase. I'm your host of the Chasing Care podcast. And I'd just like to say how grateful I am to all of the people that are following and subscribing to the show. But there's always a bit more room to grow. So please, if you haven't yet, subscribe below, like, share and follow. The Chasing Care podcast is available across all of your favourite podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. Let's get back to the show.
And is that the message that you also hear in the community? You say that you're out and about in the community, Nancy. On occasions, we run a community local event fortnightly in various parts of the UK. And that's what we hear. You ask somebody, have you planned for your future care needs? They look at you blank as if to say, why me? I was here to talk about mum or dad.
Absolutely. I think Yeah, absolutely, they do. They just say, "Well, I'll just go into a care home. I'll be all right, be looked after." I'm like, "But is that really what you want?" And they're like, "Well, no." And then when you say to them, "Well, you do know that you won't get a choice really of what you're going to have to eat that day, and it will come at the time that they say you have to have it, and that bone china mug you have your cup of tea out in the morning, you're going to get a nice little white cup or a green cup that several other people have drunk out of. It might have gone through a dishwasher, but is that what you want?" And they're like, "Well, no." And I'm like, "Well, these are your options. This is what you could look to do in the future." Yeah, it's quite strange, but it's very strange what people perceive as care for the future for themselves when they're old.
I'm not sure that there's a solution until the government starts putting these sort of things into education at a very young age. I was laughing earlier, wasn't I, Nancy, about my son, age 25. If I asked him about financial planning and everything, he'd say, "What? Oh, yeah. Why me, Dad? I'm going down the pub." It's not going to happen to me, is it? That's the thing. When you're 25, I was there. I'm not going to lie. I might be an old man now, but when I was 25, pension, what? I need it. Is that still true across the industry, do you feel, Harj, that people really don't plan for their futures?
Yeah, you hit on some really good points there. There's a section of financial services which we call protection, which relates to insurance, where people take out insurance for themselves. And what's happened is over the years, because the regulation on mortgages has ramped up so much, when somebody takes mortgage advice, they're now almost finding themselves being forced to have to talk to someone about insurance. So that sort of light is being switched on for more people now about words which we used to use back in the late 90s called income protection and critical illness cover. When we used to talk to people about it back then, we used to get really funny looks from people, almost like they were wanting to walk you out of their house. But now
I think I was one of those people, Harj, to be fair.
But those messages are now getting in there and people are more aware. If I was to wind the clock forward between the sort of demographic of clients, you get to people who are in their 50s and they may already be busy with their families, depending on when they have their kids. They may be focused on their kids and their career. That's their focus. Maybe a house move. They get to their 60s and they're really switched on now about, some of them are, about retiring and how much money am I going to have? And they're beginning to think about, I've got these pensions. I need to review them. Then they drift into retirement in their 60s, leading into their 70s, when they're still getting to grips with retirement. And they're getting to grips with spending money and have already accepted maybe how much money they've got, how long it might last. And also, they may have come to terms with their own mortality, because by that point, people may have lost parents, they may have lost siblings or friends, as I'm often being told by clients, they've lost this friend or that friend with a health issue and so on. So as people go into retirement, they're definitely aware of what can happen. However, they've still got other things going on in the background in their lifestyle and in their life, which are more of a priority still. And what you've got now is, in financial services, you've got this organization called SOLA. It's not a compulsory membership. It's a not-for-profit organization. And it's for those advisors who really want to get more involved in giving advice to older clients. But what SOLA does is it helps advisors involved in that group to really think more holistically. So when I'm talking to people about pensions in their 60s, we now have to forecast their finances into the future. We have to look at what their life expectancy might be. We have to ask them to fill out a health questionnaire, because we have to then work out, well, what if that happened to your health? What if you died at that age? How does that affect your pension? How does that affect your spouse, your plans? So we are, as an industry, financial services, moving on, educate people more about these issues as to what can happen when they get older in life and how much money they're going to have. But then it takes you as an advisor who's perhaps had these personal experiences, or through what educational qualifications you've got, or your SOLA, whatever it may be. It will take those advisors to actually make clients more aware and say, by the way, as well as all of that, you need to perhaps be mindful of this, and this is what can happen. So it is moving in that direction, but it's a bit slow.
Can I ask a question? And it's not about a specific person or anything, just generally from your background. If you were to go and see somebody in their own home to talk, let's say, about financial planning in the age of 30, would you now also include planning for health needs? Because sadly, Dr. Mosley died recently, but I did listen to his podcast, and he did say things like, the last 16 years of your life, you've got 2 really bad health issues. That's on average. That's what most people have. So we know that we might be living longer, but you're not necessarily living better. So you do need to look after yourself, and that might include having some care. So a bit of a direct question. Is this what you would do now for a 30-year-old? Start talking about when they're 50, 60, 70, they need to have cash to pay for care?
I would probably go about it in a slightly different way, because I think if I was to say that, they might be a bit offended or put off by that. So I'd have to approach it slowly by talking to them about illness. Are they aware of what illnesses could occur between now and retirement? And then, because retirement is like a point in line. It's like a line in the sand for some people. I'm going towards that point. Then they're going beyond that point. So if you can help them understand what could happen up to that point, and then if you can help them understand what can actually happen beyond that point, that's a good way of getting them. So unfortunately now I don't tend to see that many younger clients. But if I was to see clients below the age of 40, there's no age limit. But if I was to see younger clients, I would definitely check with them what level of health insurance they have in place. And I would recommend they have health insurance in place. More often than not, that insurance carries them through to 60, 65, 70. That then leads on to the question about their own personal health. And that then leads on to some questions about their family health. And that's where, you can begin to get more of an in-depth conversation with the client. I wish I was having more conversations with more clients in that age group, but I don't tend to have that many clients that young at the moment, unfortunately.
I have another question. I have lots of questions. And this is the next one. Harj, still on you. Are there policies in place? Are there plans, insurances or savings plans specifically for people later in life to pay for care?
Yeah. There is one specific policy which is called long-term care annuities. An annuity, most people know of what an annuity is from the conventional days of pensions. And they would think a pension, you take a lump sum and buy an income for the rest of your life, or you take some cash out and again, buy an income for the rest of your life with a balance. Very few people, you were asking me early on about how much people know. Most people I talk to don't know about long-term care annuities. And that is a specific policy which can help people to pay for care fees. And it's a policy specifically on the individual. It's not a off-the-shelf policy. The individual goes through a process called medical underwriting. So I would go through asking the individual's spouse or children to fill out what we call a care annuity questionnaire, ask some basic information. We then get into talking about care, and we get into talking about their care costs. We then get into talking about their health questions, because there are health questions on that form. We then have to put information on that form about where they're currently receiving care. That form goes off to a third party called Medicals Direct. They begin to request information from the individual's GP. And more often than not, a telephone interview will be requested with a care provider, such as Nancy at Mumby's or somebody in a care home. Once all the medical information is back, it gets fired off to the 4 insurance companies who provide a care annuity. And they are Aviva, Legal & General, and 2 other unknown companies, lesser known, Just and National Friendly. They're the only 4 companies that provide long-term care annuities. I normally go through the process of working out with the family beforehand what is the individual's income, what are their outgoings, and what is what we call a shortfall in meeting the cost of care. Because more often than not, there is a shortfall. That's why the cash is going down. So when I ask for figures on this care annuity, I'm asking for figures to say how much will it cost the family to provide that level of income, which is the shortfall, which can then be paid to the care provider and helps them to put a cap on, where they are with their finances. How much will that cost as a lump sum? And often families may have a budget. So I would often also put on there, how much of an income can this care annuity give them for a given lump sum? Now that care annuity, once it's actually, there's lots more to it, but once it's actually up and running, pays that income level to the care provider for the rest of the individual's life. And it will either pay an amount which has been insured from the outset by level, or it will go up every year by an inflationary measure. And that's it. And costs money because the family have to pay a lump sum into the policy. And that's where it can cause misunderstandings and can cause issues in a family, because you will get difference of opinions about people saying, well, I don't want to do that with mum's money or dad's money, because what if we do that and they then die a year into it? Where's all that money gone? And then you have to explain to them, somebody has to explain to the family, how do these things actually work and what are their options and how they can protect some of that money. And I go through all of that with the family early on, so they're fully aware of how this works, what are the cost implications and so on.
Don't let me hang. What happens to all that money? I mean, what sort of number are we talking about here? And I'm not going to hold you to this. The audience won't hold you to it.
It's very difficult. I mean, let me just give you an example. Let's just say somebody who is 85, this is purely as an example. If somebody is 85 and they're in relatively okay health and they've got a reasonable amount of income already, and they happen to just need a top up of about £2,000 a month, the last quote I saw for somebody in that position from one of the providers was at approximately £2,000 a month is what their shortfall was, and it was going to cost around £125,000. But that's purely an example, because this is the issue we have. The issue we have is, because some people in financial services have some knowledge about care annuities, and because they work very differently to other financial services products, somebody might quote a figure to a client and say, that's a ballpark figure. I've just had this with a client last week. She was quoted a ballpark figure of £340,000, and most definitely put her and her family off. And they just weren't given any other information. All they were told was, that's a ballpark figure. This is how much it's going to cost you, and you would have to pick which insurance company you want to use. Now, that unfortunately is not advice. That's not a professional service. So that's why I do try and help clients to give them an example of a similar aged client, but because everybody's health is so different and unique, and they have to go for the medical underwriting. Look, talking about it quite crudely, the insurance companies actually have to, as you would suspect, have to determine how long they think the individual will live for, and whether they feel their needs will deteriorate, and so on. So that's all going into the equation. But I'm sure you've heard of people saying when somebody goes into a care home, they might only survive 2 years and then they unfortunately die. We also know that's not necessarily true. And I'm sure, Nancy, you wouldn't have figures quite that crude, but you look after patients, I'm sure, clients who are being with you for many years, and it doesn't quite work like that. So people can continue to receive care. So I work out with families at what point is the cutoff, at which point they've actually got their money back. So it costs £50,000. Sorry, it's paying out £50,000. It's cost you £200,000. Very crudely, after 4 years, you've had your money back, haven't you? So we go through the more detailed calculations to work out for them. We also go through comparisons for them on what are their alternatives with that money. What if they invested it? And then we go through assumptions for inflation, for investment growth, for charges, and so on. We have to go through all of that, So it's difficult to give you a ballpark figure, but I understand your pain when you phrase that question to me about what happens to that money. But Conversely, families who do this because they don't want the worry of where is the money coming from. Once they've committed the money to a care annuity, they generally do it because they want to relieve themselves of the worry of how they're going to pay for that amount of care for the foreseeable future. And we've done that with one of Nancy's clients, and the family feels much relieved, and on they go. It's one less thing to worry about.
It's a big purchase to make. We know that.
Yeah.
But when you look at what the potential longevity will be of somebody receiving care and the care that they want, like Harj says, you get that back. And then families then realise, well, actually, that's my inheritance now becomes a little bit more protected. Because people who continually pay money out of their income, their savings, and then they start dipping into annuity out of the property, at some point that money has to finish. At some point that money will dry up because they've had as much as they can out of the property. Their savings have dipped down. They don't really want to, some people don't want to engage in social care. They'd just rather try and manage it themselves as a family. But with this care annuity that Harj talks about, you've got a longer term level of care that you bought yourself, you're buying it yourself, and it takes the rest of your inheritance and your family tend to be quite happy with that.
And to be fair to the audience today, we're not talking about annuities being the solution. It's just one thing that we're talking about today. And the only other one that I really know a lot about, is equity release. What other things are there, Harj? Give us a flavour as to the sort of things that people might...
I'll give you an example but it's not for somebody who's specifically in care right now, but you do come across families and clients who perhaps you would describe as elderly, but have got capacity and are in good health. And I would be working with them and their children all the same as attorneys. And we may come to a conclusion of what they're trying to do with their money because they're trying to tidy up their finances. They're doing a bit of inheritance tax planning, but at the same time, we're planning for care. And some of that planning you can do for care in those circumstances. For example, you could use an investment vehicle which satisfies the client's need for investing money for here and now. It can also satisfy their need for inheritance tax planning on gifting it to their children. But that vehicle can also give that client an access point once a year where they can access some of that money. So if they've been advised appropriately through the time, they know that, okay, I've got some cash lined up there. That's my emergency fund to go to for care. That will cover me for maybe a year or two of care. I've then got this vehicle over here, which is investing. Yes, it's going to be for the long term. Yes, it helps the kids with inheritance tax planning. But once a year, with the help of my advisor, I can go into that policy and extract some money. That then gives me money with which I can also pay for care. And people sometimes have other vehicles. These are known as investment bonds. And you can have an offshore investment bond, or you can have what's called an onshore investment bond. And some of those vehicles pay an income. So clients take an income from that vehicle. Other people use their pension as a drawdown to pay for care. There's so many variety of ways. There's becoming more of a fusion, I think, where companies are becoming more switched on to what clients' needs are, and they're trying to find a way of merging that gap, or where a client might have one need over here, but further down the road, they might have another need over here. So they're trying to find a way of bridging that gap. And I'm beginning to see that. So whereas when I'm advising families, I would be advising them on 2 or 3 different products to satisfy their overall needs. And that may address investments, inheritance tax planning, and care needs in the future. I think companies are now trying to merge the gap there a bit more. So currently there are a number of different ways people can take out savings, investments, even pensions, and they could be using a myriad of products which they can use to pay for care. Equity release and long-term care annuities, as we say, are just 2 examples of what they can do. More often than not, what I think people need is somebody to understand them, understand their needs, and give a holistic approach. And there's no harm in advising the client on what their needs are now, but you need to be mindful of what their needs are in the future. So you'll plan for that too. So these products that are out there can help you do that.
I have another question. Guess who it's for? Sorry, Nancy, I don't mean to sideline you, but this is quite fascinating. And I'm guessing that you've got a really great working relationship between your businesses, which is absolutely amazing. Otherwise, Harj wouldn't be sat here. But I'm going to ask another question. This is an opinion, probably. What you can say or what you can't say or would want to say, I don't know, Harj, but I just need to ask the question. I'm looking for care for my mum or dad, and I've been told that I should go and speak to a financial advisor. What are the dangers of speaking to the wrong people? And because look, you said you're highly regulated as an industry. I get that. Absolutely. We're highly regulated in the care sector. I see that you've got that SOLA, Society of Later Life. I can't remember the last bit.
Advisors.
Maybe you're an expert or you know what you're talking about, but could any financial advisor offer the sort of guidance that you are talking about? Or are there things that people should really be aware of and say, well, don't go for that kind of advisor, or ask the question about this before you get advice about care? Does that make sense as a question?
It does make sense. And I hear exactly what you're saying. And there's a number of ways of answering that. So I'll
honestly would be good.
Yeah, I would say one of the first things to mention is when people are speaking to an advisor or looking for an advisor, they should ideally try and find somebody who is independent. If somebody is independent, then it means that they're not tied to anyone. They don't have an agenda where they have to promote one company's products over another. So they can give a more of an unbiased opinion on what the client can and cannot do. They've got more of the marketplace to go at to choose from to advise their clients. So that's one thing to bear in mind. However, having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean if you're speaking to an advisor who's not independent, they can't help you. They surely still can. Then you need to make sure they've got the right qualifications. Have they got qualifications in giving advice on long-term care annuities, equity release, investments, inheritance tax planning, and pensions? In other words, how well versed are they to help you with a holistic approach? What you don't want to do is go and speak to someone who can only talk to you about one thing, be it pensions only or investments only. Because what can happen with some clients, and I've had this with a client last week, they happen to have an advisor who's from a very large organization. So that's the other thing. You can have an advisor who's either working for themselves. So I, for instance, run my own practice, but I trade through Sandringham Financial Partners. And that means Sandringham help me and take care of all of my compliance requirements. We are registered with the FCA, as most advisors would be, as you say. And people can have qualifications, and SOLA is there if they want to go ahead and have that accreditation too. You ideally need to speak to someone who's got experience, and as well as the qualifications. Somebody who's got experience of helping clients can demonstrate that to you through testimonials, through reviews. And if you meet someone and you're not sure, you feel that they don't necessarily have the experience, there's nothing wrong in you saying to them, I'm going to shop around. If you really want to go and look for a SOLA accredited advisor, you can go on the SOLA website and put in your postcode and find someone. Most companies now, unfortunately, I have to use a term which most people don't like, but it's called vulnerable clients. And we all know people can be vulnerable, and they can be vulnerable if they're receiving advice as well. And it's not just an age thing, and it's not just a health thing. But most companies, with the help of the FCA, the regulator, have policies in place now to say, if we're dealing with a client who's deemed vulnerable, and then maybe you're dealing with their attorney, your child or spouse, you have to have processes in place. So you have to be able to signpost them. Which advisors are most qualified to go and talk to? Go and talk to that advisor. These advisors should be referring to that advisor, and so on. So more and more companies are trying to switch onto that way of operating. Unfortunately, they're not there yet. So I think the message for clients is you need to shop around, ask people for experience, ask them what experience they have. You don't want to, for instance, just speak to an equity release advisor because that's all he can advise you on. So you really need to speak to someone who can really understand you first and foremost, has the skills to understand you, ask you the right questions, can really grab hold of your situation, can step away, can come back and say, okay, these are the options. Then they can sit with you and work through. You really need to have that kind of approach. I'm sorry if it sounds quite basic, but there's definitely more to it.
No, it sounds absolutely clear to me. I think it's great advice, and thank you for that. We're racing to the end of our podcast today, but I did want to bring Nancy in for her final thought as to why should you speak to a financial advisor if you're a family looking for care?
I think it's like what Harj says, it's about getting that honest opinion from somebody. I think it's about, again, what Harj was saying is, it's about your preference, about what you want, where you want to be. And if you're not sure about how can I fund that, then this is where you speak to the likes of Harj. We're always happy to signpost people if they're unsure. We will say, the government says, care at home, stay at home. But funding will always be a potential issue for a lot of people. And as we said, planning ahead is not in anybody's agenda. But for us, we've been able to support a lady who has been successful and is now being able to stay at home with living care.
And we know that's probably the best outcome that you could have for an individual remaining in their own home. And on that happy note, thank you very much, Nancy, for today. Thank you for being there. Sorry, I wasn't asking you lots of questions, but Harj was the expert today, and therefore I was focusing down on that. And Harj, thank you for your honesty and thank you for the clarity. Unfortunately, you haven't answered all the questions in enough detail. So it looks as if you might have to come back on in the future, and so we can drill down on some of the specifics that might be worrying people when it comes down to their financial planning and needs for long-term care, if you're happy to do so. Nancy, just to remind the audience, if they want to get hold of you or speak to Mumby's Living Care, how do they do that?
Please visit our website, www.mumbys.com, and you can reach me via the website.
And Harj, please, if you can just point people in your general direction, how do we do that?
It's probably best to email me or phone me. We have a Sandringham website, but my email is h.gill, h.gill@sandringham.co.uk, or they can phone me 07876 48 49 60 60.
Thank you both. It's been amazing. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Not going to lie, one of the best ones I think so far, because it really does help people with a bit of focus on a subject that I know worries the hell out of people. So thank you both for being here today on Chasing Care.